In the winter of 1871, Lawrence County, Arkansas, the ledgers begin to record a name that refuses to fade. Mary Whitlow, widow. Her entry does not appear among the warm notations of kinship. No children, no heirs, no property of scale. Instead, her presence is inked in the margins of death. Her life was lived behind shutters, cellar doors nailed shut, curtains never drawn, her veil never lifted. She was known in whispers as the woman in black. And over time she became not a neighbor, not a parishioner, but the shadow of the parish itself. Her house stood stark, its timbers dark, its windows blind. Yet strangely her garden did not suffer. While frost blackened the crops of others, hers flourished. Vegetables grew to impossible size. Roses bloomed through ice. Neighbors spoke of midnight hymns, drifting through the fields of lanterns, lowered into the soil of bare feet, moving among graves after midnight. The deaths began as accidents. Samuel Green, the farmhand, was found in shallow water no higher than his waist. The coroner called it drowning. But at the burial, Mary Whitlow stood without tears, motionless, almost as though she were guarding rather than mourning. Next came Thomas Abel, discovered in her garden, with soil in his lungs, his fingernails torn from frantic clawing. The record declared him mad, self-buried. The parish called him something else, her second coffin. The preacher's son followed, buried twice, once beneath the willow, and once again in rumor that she had pressed him deeper into the earth, as if gifting him to the ground itself. Then came the merchant whose coffin Mary purchased 2 weeks before his death. He never returned from her doorway. And finally, Elias, the veteran. His coffin was found, half-buried lid, clawed open from within, yet empty. No body was ever recovered. 5 coffins, none at rest. Before we continue, tell me, where are you listening from tonight and what hour of the clock meets you there? Write it in the comments below. And if these hidden histories call to you, subscribe to Gothic Ledger and step deeper with us into the archive. Mary's name was eventually struck from the parish roll. Her body was never found. What endured was not her presence, but the conviction that she had not buried men at all, but fed them alive to the earth. And in the margins of the archive, scrawled faintly, survives a single phrase: "The bride feeds still." Her story begins in the county ledgers, first as a bride, then as a widow, and then as something stranger, a figure no longer accounted for, yet continually seen. Her marriage was brief, her widowhood permanent. Official documents record no children, no property beyond a modest plot at the edge of Lawrence County. But neighbors remembered her vividly, a tall, angular figure who sat alone in the farthest pew of the church, hands gloved, head inclined, but never bowed in prayer. Some claimed she never took the sacraments. Others said she whispered her own words while the hymns were sung. Her paths always seemed to end at graves. After services, she lingered in the churchyard, her hand resting against a stone as though speaking with it. Children were told not to approach, yet they spied on her from behind fences. They remembered the stillness of her body, so fixed that insects landed on her veil as if it were carved stone. Her mourning dress became a uniform she never set aside. Even in the fiercest summer, while others turned to light cotton, Mary appeared layered in black corseted bodice, long sleeves, heavy skirts trailing in dust. Some believed they were her bridal garments dyed black after her husband's death. Others whispered she had ordered them so from the beginning, as if she had entered her marriage already prepared for loss. Though she lived alone, men continued to call at her gate, farmhands, merchants, even sons of preachers. They stood uncertain as she leaned in her doorway, silent behind her veil. For a time, they would be seen again walking beside her to church or carrying parcels into her house. But every courtship ended the same. In absence, neighbors spoke carefully, unwilling to accuse. He was there. And then, he was not. Mary Whitlow never remarried. She carried herself instead as though bound to an unseen husband. An invisible companion felt in the way she guarded her home, in the measured solitary steps she took along parish roads. And so in time, the parish whispered not that she was a widow, but a bride still, a bride to something beneath the ground, and faithful to it beyond all measure. Thus, her image entered the record, not through words of her own, but through the silences she imposed. A bride in black, a figure seated at graves, her veil obscuring not mourning, but intentions the parish would only learn once the coffins began to multiply. The first death to bind Mary Whitlow's name to county memory was that of Samuel Green. A farmhand of little reputation, his name surfaces once in the 1871 census laborer, aged 27, and then disappears forever. His body was discovered in the Clear Fork Creek, less than half a mile from Mary's boundary fence. The coroner, Elias Rowan, entered the cause as accidental drowning. The notes are brief. Body swollen face downward in silt pockets turned out marks of no evident violence. Rowan measured the water at no higher than the waist of a grown man, yet closed the case without inquiry. Beneath his signature lies a smear of ink, as though the pen lingered longer than the law permitted. What the record accepts without protest, the valley's memory reshaped into unease. Neighbors swore they had seen Samuel near Mary's gate, 2 evenings before his hat in hand posture, that of a suitor. Mrs. Carter told her grandchildren she had glimpsed the pair walking toward the creek at dusk. Her testimony was never written, yet it endured in whispers. When his body surfaced, the county handled the burial swiftly. With no kin to claim him, Samuel was placed in a pine box and lowered into the parish yard under thin attendants. Only a handful stood at the grave. What all remembered was Mary. She stood at the edge in her black attire. Gloved hands folded her veil drawn. She did not cry. She did not kneel. She placed neither flower nor soil. She remained motionless until the grave was sealed, then turned and walked home in silence. It was not grief the witnesses recalled, but vigilance. One child, long after, swore the veil lifted in the breeze, and beneath it, just for a heartbeat, lay a smile. Whether invention or memory, it took root. The grave bore no marker. Grass erased it in weeks. But the parish called it Mary's first coffin. Samuel Green faded from the census, but his absence became the first measure of a pattern. His death was not remembered for its cause, but for the shadow it cast across the widow in black, whose presence at burials seemed less like condolence and more like covenant. The silence of law could survive one coffin. But the second broke it. Thomas Abel was next. A tradesman of 30, recorded as a seller of seed and grain. His visits to Mary's gate had grown too frequent not to be remarked upon, though no formal courtship was declared. In October 1871, he failed to appear at Sunday service. At first, no alarm. Men vanished for days on errands or trade. But a week passed. His mule remained untended, his goods still at the livery. Whispers shifted toward worry. Searchers scoured the valley. Trails yielded nothing. The inquiry might have ended in silence again had not a child strayed too near Mary Whitlow's fence. Sent to gather wild onions, he returned pale, shaken, speaking of an odor that rose from her soil. The sheriff, pressed by complaint, entered the garden with 2 deputies. In a far corner, beneath a thin skin of freshly turned earth, they uncovered a body wrapped in coarse cloth. It was Abel, and unlike Samuel Green, whose drowning could be filed away, Abel's corpse pressed against the limits of explanation. The coroner identified the remains as Thomas Abel. Though his face had collapsed in decay, recognition rested on his clothing and the contents of his pockets. The report, still preserved in the county archive, reads as follows. Subject buried alive. Soil present in throat and lungs. No fracture. No mark of assault. Nails broken both hands. Evidence of struggle. Recommend judgment, self-burial through madness. Those words, underlined twice in the margin, remain among the strangest notes ever entered into the Lawrence County record. Mary Whitlow's involvement was never formally established. She permitted the search without resistance, stood aside as the body was lifted from her garden. Testimonies describe her posture as rigid, her voice absent, her veil unbroken. She neither denied knowledge nor offered it. When the sheriff asked why the soil had been so recently turned, she replied only, "The earth requires feeding." The phrase was copied into the sheriff's notes, but later struck through before filing. Still, the neighbors remembered it. For many nights before Abel's disappearance, digging had been heard from her garden. Some swore they saw her bent to the soil by lamplight, skirts pulled up, her hands blackened to the wrists. None testified openly. Whether from fear or reverence, their silence became part of the record. Abel's burial, when it came, was without ceremony. His coffin, sealed, quickly lowered into parish ground without marker, as if erasure itself might still the unease. But it did not. 2 coffins now stood in memory, both tied to the widow in black. The ledgers called it madness. The parish called it something else, a pattern. If Mary Whitlow unsettled the community, her dwelling unsettled it more. County surveyors described it simply, a single-room timber house of uncertain age frame, sturdy, though windowed poorly. Yet what was deficiency in record became deliberation in rumor. By 1871, every window of the Whitlow home had been shuttered, nailed, not merely closed. Boards cross-fitted and sealed, barring intrusion and escape alike. Even in summer heat, no curtain stirred, no glass caught the light. The cellar had been treated the same. Sheriff Rowan's inspection log records iron nails, driven deep planks, bolted until no hinge remained. The rusted lock concealed beneath a second board hammered across. It was no door, but a wall, a refusal. Neighbors whispered that the house grew inward, swallowing itself until no one could say what lay beneath. But what could not be shuttered was the garden. Testimony describes it, flourishing when all other soil lay barren. Tomatoes heavy as stones, squash so large they required 2 men to lift roses blooming in November frost. One farmer remarked that her land never slept, never dried. And though abundance might have invited envy, it was feared instead. For many believed the ground's vigor came from something below. Something the nailed cellar and blind windows sought to contain. And then there was the night. Private journals later entered into county archive record noises rising long after midnight. Rhythmic strikes of metal into soil. The turning of earth. At times, a low cadence, half hymn, half murmur. One woman swore she heard scripture bent into strange patterns. Another claimed the sound ceased whenever she neared her fence, as if the silence itself had ears. The surveyor, dry in tone, noted only owner absent from social company. Structure sound but unwelcoming. Land uncommonly productive. But the township read something else between those lines. The house, sealed and blind, had become a witness, a keeper. Some claimed its boards groaned at night, shifting under strain. Others swore the chimney breathed without smoke-releasing air, warmed by nothing human. Children dared each other to approach to lay hands on the nailed shutters. They returned whispering of a faint vibration beneath their palms, like a heartbeat. Such tales were dismissed by elders in daylight, yet repeated in hushed tones by firelight. And so, the house acquired its own reputation distinct even from Mary herself. Where she walked in black along the parish road, the house waited, silent, watching, not passive but vigilant, as if it too was bound in covenant with the earth. Thus, the Whitlow dwelling entered the record not merely as timber and stone, but as something other, an inward-turning presence, a house that seemed to see without eyes, that held its silence as witness to each vanishing. It guarded what lay beneath, even as its mistress veiled and unyielding stepped beyond its walls. The death of Jonathan Pike, son of Reverend Elias Pike, marked the moment when whispers around Mary Whitlow crossed from accident into accusation. Parish rolls list Jonathan at age 24, a young man who aided in hymns and kept order in the pews. His entry ends abruptly deceased October 1871. In the margin, the pastor's hand added only 2 words buried twice. Jonathan had been noticed at Mary's property in the weeks before his death. His father thundered from the pulpit that no woman wrapped forever in mourning could lead a man into honest covenant. Yet Jonathan persisted, carrying parcels to her gate, once even walking beside her toward the Clear Fork fields. At first, his absence from service raised little concern. But within 3 days, his body was found beneath the great willow at the churchyard's southern edge. The coroner's report describes a scene both ordinary and aberrant. The body lay shallow in the soil, earth displaced, as if the grave had been disturbed. The coffin boards were damp, though newly set, bearing signs of exhumation before burial. Jonathan's suit was stained not only by the pale clay of the churchyard, but by soil of another hue, dark, almost black, threaded with unfamiliar roots. Either the coffin had been shifted after burial, or it had once been filled with earth that belonged to ground far from consecration. Parishioners murmured of Mary's presence that night. One woman claimed she saw a figure in black kneeling by the willow hands pressed deep into the loosened earth. Another recalled a hymn carried softly across the stones, words unrecognizable, yet rising and falling with the cadence of Rock of Ages. None dared testify, but in private journals now preserved the same refrain. Recurs Mary had given Jonathan the ground twice, once to death, and once to something beneath death. When the Reverend preached that Sunday, he spoke not his son's name. Instead, he warned of soil that devours what it should preserve. Congregants heard his words as both confession and condemnation and accusation against Mary without her name spoken aloud. What endured in memory was not the coroner's phrasing, but the whispered sentence repeated at hearths. She does not bury, she feeds the ground. Jonathan's grave bore a marker, yet within weeks it sank unevenly, the mound shifting as if restless. Grass refused to root there. Parish children crossed to the far side of the yard, one boy swearing he saw a handprint pressed into the mud after rain. None investigated further. Thus, the third coffin tied Mary Whitlow, not merely to death, but to something ritual. If the first had been chance and the second madness, the third carried intent and exchange enacted between Widow's Vale and Churchyard Willow, between earth and those committed to it. The parish records grew spare at this point, as if words could not carry what belief already held, that beneath the widow's mourning cloth and beneath the willow's branches, something sacred had been overturned. By late 1871, the County Registry of Lawrence showed a pattern that no clerk could ignore. The names Green Abel Pike appeared in different hands across separate folios, each tied to death entries that alone seemed ordinary. But together, they traced an orbit. Each man had been last seen in Mary Whitlow's company. The coroner's book, still preserved in brittle ink, reveals hesitation even within the office of record. For green lungs, congested, though water depth shallow. For Abel soil in throat nails, broken signs of struggle beneath earth. For Pike, second burial suggested coffin-disturbed stains foreign to location. These notations read less as findings than as unease captured on paper. One clerk copying the record placed an asterisk beside each case, noting in the margin a single word association. It was underlined twice, then struck through as though fear silenced what the hand first dared to write. Still the question lingers between the lines. The sheriff's docket adds its weight. Reports of midnight, sounds at the Whitlow property, digging low, hymn-like murmurs. Lanterns moving in the garden were filed, but always closed with the same phrase, no offense observed. Page after page repeats it, giving the impression not of resolution but of refusal. A bureaucracy unwilling to confront what it could not name. Thus, the horror emerges not in any single line, but in the pattern they form. 3 men gone within months, each bound to the same widow, each lowered into ground that gave back signs of unrest. The coroner's own aside under Abel's name, remains haunting hands contorted toward chest as if resisting enclosure. No cause assigned, no inquiry pursued, and so the record moved on other deaths, other entries, yet the sequence had already carved itself into memory. Clerks confessed later to unease each time Mary's name appeared in tax rolls or property deeds, as though her presence seeped through the ink itself, staining the page with something that resisted erasure. Thus, the ledger itself became complicit, not in conspiracy, but in accumulation. Between one entry and the next, between margin notes and official signatures, a pattern formed. Parishioners whispered curses, neighbors spoke of midnight hymns, and in the county's own hand unease bled through. Soil in the lungs. unexplained punctures. Bodies that resisted burial yet were buried still. In this alignment of deaths, the record ceased to be neutral. It became the fourth coffin, unseen yet weighty, holding not flesh but evidence sealing repetition beneath ink and paper. A bureaucracy that wrote without naming truth, yet left in its own words the shadow of a widow, lengthening with each entry. If the county's ledgers hinted at Mary Whitlow's bond with death, the ground behind her house displayed another ledger altogether, written not in ink, but in roots and blossoms. Her garden, stretching along the shuttered rear of her dwelling, thrived in defiance of season and drought. Parishioners noted that where their own fields cracked and withered, Mary's soil remained dark pliant, always giving. Witnesses described tomatoes that filled both hands cucumbers, longer than a child's arm roses, blooming through winter frost with petals the color of fresh blood. Corn towered higher than her roof stalks, bowed with impossible weight. Rotation rest. These common rules seemed absent. Her ground required no pause, as if its vigor came from a source other than rain and sun. Farmers who had wrestled all their lives with Arkansas clay observed her plenty with equal parts envy and dread. Among the testimonies preserved, the sheriff's wife offers a singular vision. Passing the Whitlow property at dusk, she glimpsed Mary kneeling at the garden's edge, a small pail beside her. Expecting water, she looked closer. What poured along the roots was not clear liquid, but something darker. It clung as blood. Thus she wrote thicker than water, and the soil drank it eagerly. Her words were never entered into the docket, but remained in a private journal, later surrendered by her descendants. Speculation spread. Some suggested she had devised a secret fertilizer blending animal blood with earth, but others noted the impossibility of such supply unless the source was not animal, and they pointed instead to the rhythm of missing men. Each abundance in her garden seemed to follow upon a disappearance. The sheriff himself admitted in private notes that when he inspected Abel's grave, he had touched earth from Mary's garden. Loamy and red, he described it, unlike the clay of this valley soil, enriched by flesh rather than by season. He underlined the phrase, once then left it without conclusion, as though regretting it even as he wrote. Children refused her fruit. One boy remembered Mary offering him a peach, vast and flawless, and felt its weight as unnatural. Families who purchased from her stall found produce that spoiled not gradually, but collapsed overnight, as if life within it had been forced instead of grown. Thus, her garden became its own evidence, an archive of fertility, too vigorous to be innocent. Where coffins spoke of earth closing over men, the garden spoke of earth opening in return, converting flesh into harvest. Between vines and roses, the parish saw not cultivation, but covenant, an unspoken pact between widow and soil, sealed in roots that drew more than rain. The fourth coffin entered record not through coroner's notes, but through commerce. A receipt survives from undertaker Jebediah Crow, dated November 3rd, 1871, one coffin. Pine adult male size, paid in full by Mrs. M. Whitlow. Crow's signature is clear. Mary's mark is only a faint cross, her veil concealing more. What unsettles is not the purchase, but the timing. For 2 weeks later, merchant Robert Clay vanished. Clay, a trader from Batesville, was known for lodging with parish families. Yet in Lawrence Valley, he stayed with Mary. Witnesses recalled him at her table hat on his knee, eyes downcast as though uneasy but unwilling to offend. Then he was gone. His mule remained tethered by her fence bridle, worn unused. Clay himself disappeared. The burial followed swiftly, arranged not by kin, but by strangers. A coffin arrived, already sealed, its boards nailed so tightly they splintered. The men who bore it were unknown to the parish, arriving without introduction, leaving before dusk. No sermon, no family, only Mary at the grave. She stood in silence, hands clasped, veil unlifted, just as she had for Green, for Abel, for Pike. Years later, Clerk Samuel Wright, keeper of the undertaker's accounts, gave a deposition. He testified that Mary had ordered that coffin before Clay was last seen alive. He had not questioned her. Coffins were often purchased in advance, yet her composure disturbed him. She gave no name, only said, "It is required." And when Clay was lowered into the ground, Wright admitted he knew whose coffin she had bought. No exhumation was ever ordered. The sealed coffin was accepted without question, the sheriff claiming no grounds to intervene. Yet, the valley read it differently. To them it confirmed a cycle. The widow who purchased coffins for the living, who buried men without witness, who walked home from each grave as if escorting no one but herself. Thus, the fourth coffin joined the sequence heavier, not for its contents but for its foresight. Where the first had been an accident, the second a madness, the third a sacrilege. The fourth carried premeditation, a coffin ordered weeks before its occupant disappeared. The ledger of commerce became, like the coroner's book, another silent witness. In its columns, money exchanged for wood, but beneath the figures lay acknowledgement that Mary Whitlow had measured death before it came. By winter of 1871, the rhythm of her appearances changed. Once she had been seen in daylight at gravesides. Now she was witnessed beneath night skies. Records survive not in formal dockets, but in scattered diaries and trembling recollections. Mrs. Adeline Carter, a neighbor, preserved in her journal an entry dated December 14th. "I saw the widow walking without shoes, the hem of her black skirt heavy with dew. She moved with purpose toward the churchyard. No lantern in her hand, yet her steps were sure as though the dark itself was her guide." The entry falters, midway hesitation visible in the handwriting before resuming. "I heard her voice at the graves whispering, though not in words I knew." Other recollections gathered years later echo the same. A boy of 10 claimed he and his brother had followed her one night among the stones. He described her kneeling at a grave, newly filled her veil, lifted lips pressed to the soil. What fixed itself in his memory was not the sound, but the sight, her mouth smeared dark with earth when she rose again, as if she had drunk from the ground itself. He confessed this only once in old age, saying he carried the image through his life like a sickness. That winter, the parish register recorded disturbances among the dead. Graves sealed weeks before were found unsettled, soil-shifted markers tilted. In one case, coffin boards briefly exposed before the ground was pressed flat again. Nothing was missing. The sexton's notes describe it with caution, soil displaced, then smoothed as though touched with care rather than malice. From such fragments, an image emerged. Mary walking barefoot through frost, whispering into the earth, her voice low enough to blend with the wind between stones. Children swore the cadence resembled hymns, but twisted sacred rhythm turned toward unfamiliar syllables. Parishioners avoided the charge of witchcraft, speaking instead of misapplied mourning. a phrase that appears once in vestry minutes left unexplained. The sheriff's docket, repeating its refrain, added the final layer. Reports of widow abroad at midnight. Digging heard. No crime observed. The words no longer sounded like clearance, but like surrender. And so, her nightly procession survived only in fragments. Diaries, marginal notes, whispered recollections, all describing the same vision. A veiled widow, barefoot on frozen ground, bending her face to the soil as though speaking into its mouth. Whether her prayers addressed the dead or something beneath them remained unspoken. But in the valley's memory, she ceased to be a mourner. She became an officiant, keeping a ritual known only to her. The case of Elias Warren, a veteran of the late Civil War, marked the culmination of the Whitlow sequence. His name enters the parish roll in December 1871, annotated, lodged at Whitlow House, last seen alive. Witnesses place him at Mary's table on the evening of December 27th. His hands trembled as he lifted his cup, his complexion pale, his voice reduced to whisper. He seemed as if the air within her shuttered house thinned around him. By dawn, Elias was gone. What followed broke the prior pattern. His absence was not answered by a sealed coffin, borne to consecrated ground. Instead, a farmhand drawn by stench uncovered what appeared to be a half-buried box at the edge of Mary's property, where her garden soil bled into woodland. The lid was warped, soil spilling inward. When he touched it, the boards gave way, releasing the smell of decay into the frost. The coroner's report, entered under case number 41, remains the most clinical document in the Whitlow record. It notes with restraint coffin incomplete, subject absent, lid bearing abrasions, consistent with clawing from interior. The wood showed long parallel gouges, nails bent outward as though resisting force applied from within. No body was recovered. Only a few tufts of cloth wool dyed blue and grey fragments of a soldier's coat. The occupant had either escaped or been taken before the coffin was discovered. The lid itself was preserved for months in the county lockup. Jurors and townspeople alike described it later, recalling splinters torn loose by desperate hands, streaks of blood darkened into the grain. The sight was said to have silenced the courtroom. Yet no verdict followed, for without a body, the law could not deliver judgment. Neighbors free of legal restraint supplied their own testimony. One woman claimed she heard a man's voice before dawn, muffled as though calling from beneath the ground. Another swore she saw Mary Whitlow herself standing at the pit's edge vale, lifted her head bent toward the bogs as if listening. By the time others arrived, only the half-buried coffin remained. The sheriff's deposition attempted neutrality closing, with the phrase, "Circumstances suggest premature burial," whether self-inflicted or assisted, unknown. But the words betrayed avoidance. For what man could place himself in a coffin, lower the lid, and drive the nails from within? Thus, the fifth coffin differed from all the rest. Where the first had been accident, the second madness, the third desecration, and the fourth foresight, the fifth yielded not a body, but a void. The claw marks bore witness to life struggling inside, the bent nails to strength exerted against confinement, the emptiness to an absence the county could not explain. From this void, darker speculation grew. Some whispered Elias Warren had clawed his way free and fled into the woods, though no trace was ever found. Others believed the ground itself had taken him, dragging him deeper than coffin or soil could hold. In this refusal to produce a corpse, the Whitlow pattern reached its most dreadful point. Not the presence of death, but its distortion. By winter's end, the valley no longer spoke of Mary Whitlow's men as merely dead. The idea had taken root that the earth itself had consumed them alive. Farmers remarked first, writing in journals, that her fields seemed untouched by flood or drought. Where their own acres washed away or cracked open, Mary's remained lush. John Carpenter noted in January 1872, "It is not fed by rain, but by something it keeps to itself." Others made the connection more bluntly. A hog farmer wrote that when he buried stock on his land, grass refused to grow above the mounds. Yet, in Mary's garden, graves blossomed into rows of corn and roses. "It is as if her ground eats what we bury," he confessed. Even Sheriff Rowan, cautious in tone, left an unsettling note. After inspecting the remains of Abel, he recorded soil in lungs, nails broken, subject not fully deceased at interment. The question mark rare in his reports betrayed hesitation. To some, it suggested that Abel and perhaps others had gone into the earth, still breathing their last struggles, feeding the soil as surely as their decay. Children added grotesque images. One claimed to hear pounding beneath the garden soil like fists striking from below. Another swore he saw the ground ripple, swelling, before sinking flat again. Adults dismissed the tales but repeated them in private, unable to ignore how closely they echoed the claw-scarred coffin of Elias Warren. Fear spread that Mary had not buried the dead at all, but delivered the living into the earth, using the soil itself as devourer. Parishioners began to call her garden the bride's feast, a phrase first scribbled in shorthand in vestry notes. Even those who scoffed at ritual could not deny the unnatural fertility of her land. Surveyors remarked that her acreage stayed moist without irrigation. Botanists collected samples reporting only unusual richness of compost. The absence of explanation only deepened suspicion. Thus, Mary's role shifted once more in the valley's imagination. No longer simply mourner, no longer even killer, she became mediator between the living and the ground, transmuting men into roots and blossoms. Each coffin was not an end, but an offering. The land answered with abundance. Official action came slowly, not from courage, but from accumulation. By January 1872, 5 men had vanished, and whispers had become demand. Sheriff Rowan, pressed by the parish, recorded his decision in terse lines. Whitlow property sealed for inspection. Premises to be entered with deputies present. The search commenced at midday. Witnesses gathered along the road, watching as the sheriff and 3 deputies forced their way through the nailed front door. Shutters splintered under their hands, but what greeted them was not the stench of decay. Rowan's notes describe instead a stillness uncanny in its purity. The interior bore no signs of disturbance, only a table and a single chair placed as though awaiting company that never came. The phrase carved upon the board, 5 coffins, 1 bride passed from artifact into legend. The coffins, empty of flesh but heavy with soil, were lowered not as remains but as relics, and the bride, whether vanished executed or buried in her own garden, endured in absence. Mary Whitlow ceased to exist as woman and entered the valley as myth. No longer bound to registry or parish roll, she lived on in whispers, her silence amplified into folklore. She became the widow who carried coffins into the ground and then disappeared, leaving graves that held no bodies, only the weight of dread. Decades later, the Whitlow house collapsed into ruin. Its beams sagged, shutters fell, and the parish ploughed the land into memory. Yet the soil remained marked, its qualities immune to erosion, unmoved by cultivation. Field reports from the 1890s, preserved in county agricultural surveys, noted the property as peculiarly resistant to tilling. Farmers complained of spades bending backward of blades, striking not stone, but something harder, as if the ground itself refused intrusion. One survey by Thomas Weathers in 1896 recorded, at 3 feet depth encountered dense soil of dark composition impossible to break further. Instruments recoiled as if struck by hidden current no ordinary clay. His language, though dry, betrays unease. He abandoned the attempt, leaving only the verdict unfit for farming. Folklore thickened over these failures. Farmers swore that seed, scattered on the Whitlow plot, either refused to sprout or twisted into unrecognizable forms. Children were warned to keep away, told the soil still listened for footsteps. A tale passed through 3 generations described oxen collapsing mid-plow hooves, dragged downward as though the ground pulled with invisible weight. Excavation in the 1920s, ordered during plans for a roadway, unearthed not foundations, but pockets of soil, darker than the rest, streaked with splintered wood. The shovels lifted damp fragments resembling coffin boards, impossibly preserved. A foreman later confessed, it was as if the boxes had dissolved into the earth, leaving only their outlines behind. Work halted. The site was abandoned. Yet, the diaries of families near the valley preserve the same refrain. The bride feeds still. The phrase became shorthand for the soil's refusal for spades, that recoiled for crops, that withered for the restless heaviness beneath one's feet. No house was ever raised upon the plot, though timber was scarce and fields coveted. The land remained an absence marked not by fences, but by memory. The final archival note appears in 1931, when a county inspector filed a survey of abandoned properties. Beneath the Whitlow entry stands a single sentence, startling in its subjectivity. The ground is not vacant, but occupied, though by what cannot be named. His successor struck the line but left it legible beneath. Thus, the legacy of Mary Whitlow did not end with her disappearance, nor with the 5 coffins without bodies. It lingered in the soil which resisted erasure, preserved its silence, and bore witness without words. Where homes rotted and gardens failed, her acre remained a black refusal feeding on memory, as once it had on men. In the valley's final ledger, no closure was written. Only the chilling refrain repeated in margins and whispers in the silence of farmers who turned their plows away. The bride feeds still.